The question then is on passage of the bill as amended. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Barrasso.
Elizabeth? Oops.
Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Romney? Mr. Romney, no. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Rounds? Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Sass? Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida? Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Sinema? Ms. Sinema, aye. Ms. Smith? Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Tillis? Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Tuberville? Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Warnock? Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Warren? Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no.
No senator wishes to change their vote. If not, the yeas are 50, the nays are 49. The bill as amended is passed.